floor is now open for discussion of these two marvelous papers. Yes.
Thank you. Those were amazing papers, really, just so stimulating and brilliant. So I have a question, I guess maybe it's more for Bonnie, but I think it connects maybe for both of you, which is that I was thinking of another addition to the performative, which is Sedgwick on the peri-performative, right? And which she says the peri-performative, instead of saying, you know, we hereby consecrate this ground, the peri-performative says, we get a kick out of consecrating this ground. Or she says it's like the rhetorical force, the way that the rhetorical force of the performative rarefies or concentrates in unpredictable clusters and outcrops and so on. So I'm wondering if that's improvisatory or if there's a way to connect this notion. I mean, first of all, Bonnie, if you just have thoughts about the peri-performative and how it fits in relation to the deformative, and then if peri-performative speaks to you, Maya.
Is this working? Yeah? Okay. I'll do this. Excuse me. Yeah, I've worked with the with Sedgwick's idea of the peri-performative in other work of mine. I didn't. Listening to you quote from her, I could hear its queerness, but I hadn't previously thought of it as a specifically queer version of performativity, the way that the deformative is. So I didn't think to talk about it today, and I might revisit that. I use it in order to talk about, in my book about the Antigone, to talk about how Creon uses peri-performativity to interpolate Antigone back into normative sex-gender expectations. Or I'm sorry, why did I say it that way? It's not, it's the back eye. 10 in the morning is too early for a panel. I apologize. It's in the back eye, and it's not Creon, it's Cadmus, and it's not Antigone, it's Agave. But it's all C's and A's, I'm realizing, so maybe that's why. So Cadmus says to Agave, who has, from his perspective, lost his mind and gone into a kind of outbreak of spontaneity outside the city, leaving all grammatical and other kinds of expectations behind, Cadmus says to her, can you hear me? That's first. And then, who's your husband? And then, what's the name of your son? And none of those expressly say, you're a woman, you're my daughter, you have obligations, you are married, you have a child, right? They're all in a kind of circumventing way. They circumnavigate those moralizations. But in so doing, they successfully sort of bring her to his way of thinking. So that's, I think, a great example of how peri-performatives can work, have something that doesn't look like a performative is actually doing that kind of work of reconstituting, resignifying. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that for now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess all I can say is really that the term improvisation really does name a lacuna that I'm trying to redress through this kind of recuperated notion of spontaneity, but of course there's no guarantee that a single usage of the word on its own will not fall into or be foreclosed by the primitivist imaginary. And so I've seen musicians use all kinds of linguistic strategies to dodge or differentiate themselves from that discourse that is constantly trying to recapture you know, the thing that is named by improvisation.
Erin?
Thank you both for really beautiful and brilliant talks. I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one brief one for each of you. Maya, I love what you're doing for so many reasons. One of them being that you're really trying to kind of follow different kind of aesthetic formal instances of the production of concepts. And I'm remembering how when I watched you give a talk at MLA, and I told you this the other day, like I kept thinking that you had said something about chasing after.
Yeah.
And so there was this idea like that there was movement involved and that there were bodies involved and that temporality was really important. So I think I have, I guess one question related to that, like what role does temporality and kind of bodily movement have to do in kind of the theory that you're describing? And then something more specific with Morrison, because I mean, I love how you're reading again kind of these kind of really vital conceptual problems into formal experiments carried out by her, but then the kind of commentary in her introductions, which is something as a different genre, are, you know, they're so important. And I was so curious about the book that's self-aware. So like what kinds of notions of subjectivity are being brought up there? What kinds of, I mean, but it's an object that's aware of itself. So I kind of had a question about that.
Yeah.
And then for Bonnie, I loved how I was hoping you would end that way. And I loved thinking about kind of the rapport between the performative and the deformative. And so I think that my question for you is, you know, first to think more about the deformative in relation to, I mean, deformative is that's like a negative, that's commonly understood as like a negative thing. If you're deforming someone's speech, if you're deforming someone's image, their reputation, that is like, we generally agree that's a bad thing, right? And I think that there's more to it, and I think you were beginning to maybe hint at what is there. And it makes me think of Butler's use of misrecognition, where, you know, again, like commonly we think like we want to be recognized. Recognized is like an ethically and politically important thing to pursue and achieve. But misrecognition for Butler is so important because there is always this haunting misrecognition in any ostensible, you know, the Althusserian scene of interpolation being, you know, the most famous example. So, and then finally, what's form doing there in the heart of both of those concepts, maybe even in response to Maya's paper.
Sure. Thanks so much, Erin. You have really helped me develop these topics and my thinking about them. And I do think that that element of temporality or the kinetic, you know, aspect of thought that you were talking about, it is part of what draws me to Kant's account of spontaneity, which I think really does have a hard time being assimilated into contemporary discussions. And part of it is because that dynamic creativity that he's describing is underpinning objective judgment. So it's a kind of structural creativity underlying the possibility of objective validity. So even in cases where there's only one way to synthesize something, that is still an expression of spontaneity for him. And so it's thinking those two dynamics together, you know, the interest in the creative, the kinetic, the activity, the process of doing as being related to this outcome called an objectively valid judgment. I think that's really interesting, Morrison, as well in this project, when she talks about a narrator or a book that is revising itself as it's going along. She is distinguishing the narrator of jazz from the omniscient narrator. I mean, she even says, this was my attempt to take down the omniscient narrator. It is a narrator who at the very end says, you know what, I have been really foreclosing the subjectivity of all these characters I've been following. I've been imposing my own presuppositions. I've been negating their spontaneity, you might say, and has this kind of self-revising moment that Morrison thinks is formally what that move is formally learned from jazz musicians. So it is the opposite of the jazz musician as the rhapsodic excess, which is also what we see in the Wordsworth, right? Just the overflow. No, for her, the jazz musician is the self-revising honing of an objectivity through the artistic.
So I don't know very much about form or art, but I have a thought anyway. Because when I read that passage by Morrison and other similar passages by creative writers, I hear or see a kind of experience that is not unfamiliar to me, which is a kind of loss of separateness from the object of your creation. The Frankenstein motif will be doing more work, as I think, as I develop this paper. But a kind of loss of separateness from the object of creation. Like, how you can spend weeks sort of just trying to craft an argument out of a bunch of ideas that you have and pull out your quotes and it feels like labor, labor, labor. And then all of a sudden things come together for better or worse. And then suddenly it feels like the paper's writing you. And I feel like that's a feature of a great deal of creative process. I'm not sure I would call it spontaneity in the ordinary sense of the word, but it may be something like what Kant was calling spontaneity. I don't know. But at some point, we enter the world that we've created, and then it starts to recreate us. So there's a kind of performativity in that, right? Where the object, the world, the paper, the argument sort of produces you in its proximity rather than the more instrumental version of work that we're also familiar with. With reference to what you said about Butler, I think what's really important about the way that they talk about recognition is that it always fails, but it also succeeds, right? And so, so there's a way in which, that could be woven through some of the points that Maya was making, that, there's a legibility and then there's a something else. It's a lacuna, it's a spontaneity, it's a queerness that doesn't get captured. It's converted into identity on Butler's account, as on mine. And then there's more. There's more. And the kind of identity, the identitarianism that seeks to be totalizing is wounding for that reason. But that's not an argument against, per se, at least to my mind, against the importance of recognition and the importance of accessing legibility in a social order so as to be able to be a bearer of rights, even if there's a kind of double bind to that. And the only other thing I'll say about, with reference to your question about the deformative side, for Sedgwick, the key example of deformativity is shame, the sentence, shame on you. That's a deformative utterance, she says. And this, as Heather Love also points out, a kind of really originary experience of queerness in which, with that phrase, some people find out for the first time that they are different. That's how you find out when someone mocks you. Jose Munoz talks about it in Cruising Utopia, how he walked with a swish in front of his cousins when he was 7, and they made fun of his walk, and that's when he found out. Oh, he didn't know what it meant to be gay, but he found out something. He didn't know what yet. So Sedgwick does say that the deformative can be reworked. I think this is one reason why she doesn't take the tack that I am suggesting she could have taken, which is to make the deformative the seamy underside of performativity, possibly. I mean, it's always a question, right? But she doesn't do that, and I think it's because for her, the founding example is shame on you. She moves into the possibilities of reworking shame by way of pride. And so pride becomes the sort of reworking of the deformative. So I think that means that's fine. That's definitely a thing that happens within the world of queer politics, but it misses the opportunity to pay attention to the deformative impact of things that we think of as performatives.
I mean, and the reappropriation of the signifier queer is an example of this, right? So queer etymologically is related to distortion. So it's like it's a conscious political attempt to say, okay, hold on, this is our distortion, and we're claiming something that's distorting. And then also Heather Love's description is of gender dissonance, which is a sonic metaphor.
Yes, which I was
but
trying
a
to
deformative
to
sonic
with the Phaleric bull, which is a sonic torture. So the only thing, I just want to resist a little bit that, because I want to agree with it, but every form of new performativity that redresses the prior deformative dimension, in this case of identity, queer politics comes along and resignifies queer, but is not necessarily fully open to various forms of trans politics. So every identitarian move grounds politics, but also remainders. And the deformative could be seen as an expression of what happens in that remaindering process. So that would just be my hesitation.
Michael.
Thank you both for these really enriching talks. I want to try to put them together with a question that kind of starts with the Phaleric Bull, where you left off, and through Hartman, and then get to the blues as a way to kind of bridge to mine. And in doing so, I'm going to commit an act of almost Black studies blasphemy and saying there's no reason to believe that music sounded good on the plantation, right?
Mhm.
And I get to that by what you're saying, right? The sound of torture that you so aptly described with the Phaleric Bull is described by some as music, but probably is actually just a sound of like a kind of chaotic cry, right? That then what happens in that interstitial space is then becomes musical representation. The blues become musical reputation of that thing that didn't sound good, that then is reversed to believe that the fields were full of, like, you know, Aretha Franklin and you know, Al Green, basically, which is, there's no reason to believe that any of it sounded like anything, which is part of the dystopia of the plantation, right? It's like part of the scene there. So I'm thinking about, in your notion of the performative, just how that space between what the sound really is and then what it gets recreated as becomes the form that then Maya's proposing becomes a space for innovation and spontaneous reproduction of that thing again, to then give the listener, the performer, and the observer some relationship to that, the thing itself, without having to recreate the kind of primality of it, right? Which is what I understand Hartman to be concerned about, and Moten too, and the notion of Aunt Hester's cries, right, that then get recreated by Abby Lincoln and Max Roach in the triptych. Does that make sense at all?
Yes, it does make sense. Let's see. Should I go first? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So let me see if I've understood you. I think when I first noticed the Phaleric Bull in Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, a term I've read that book 1,000 times. I never noticed it before. For some reason, this time it grabbed me, maybe because I was writing about Austin's bull. When I first noticed it, I went and read about it, and I don't know, it's a weird thing to say, but I almost don't know what's the worst part of the punishment, that someone is being cooked alive in a metal hollow object has a fire beneath it, or that their cries of anguish are heard as music by the person inflicting the punishment and those gathered, that music gathers a crowd. And so it's not quite to be said that it's insult to injury, but it's injury to injury. And I did think of how Hartman talks about the coffle that Lincoln and others, there are records of Lincoln and others having witnessed enslaved people being taken to market and forced. She doesn't talk in this part of Scenes of Subjection about the songs in the field so much as the songs that they are forced or lured somehow to be singing on their way to the market to add to their own value as happy slaves instead of suffering slaves. And so she talks about how the song, as it were, covers the suffering. She also talks about moments that you could call resistant, in which those songs become dirge-like, still conforming with the master's command, but not telegraphing exactly happiness. So there's a big conjugation of what happens in that scene between those who elicit songs of supposed happiness with a whip, and all the various permutations that are possible in response to that. She doesn't want, and I think very rightly so, to repeat the wrong of finding agency in the singing, because the singing is enforced. It's extracted. And at the same time, she does want to say how you sing, people, and to record the instances in which there was resistance. So I'm nervous about saying there's something here that becomes or is transformed. Like, it's exactly what says she doesn't want to do, which is to find in the suffering the material out of which a transcendent song later comes, like an Aretha Franklin. So I'm kind of trying to respect that and not say it while acknowledging that what she would as well, which is that there's a set of cultural resources that are available that are then reworked. But I'm avoiding transformation or transcendence. You didn't say those words, but I worried about the possibility of seeing it that way. So that's why I stopped where I did, because I want to think about it some more. I'm not exactly sure what the right way is to go with that. Thank you.
You know, Michael, I agree with you that there is a way in which the sorrow songs, as a point of origin for subsequent traditions, deforms totally the possibility of a linear chronology of Black music. At the same time, there is a way in which the formal problems set up, for example, by Douglas's difficulty hearing the sorrow songs. And I don't know how exactly he puts it, but the joyful sentiment with the sorrowful tone, the sorrowful tone with the joyful sentiment, that sets up a necessary rubric that is anti-mimetic, that is anti-verisimilitude, that does inform. Let me put it this way: ignoring that informs mishearing of the blues. So there is a perspective from which that anti-mimetic formal problem from the sorrow songs is necessary for subsequent listening practices all the way to Aretha Franklin. So I can see both sides of that.
Timothy.
Thank you. Yes, tremendous papers. I wanted to, I think I was going to ask a question that's very similar to Erin's about in a way, the object relation, the subject-object relations that are implicit in Bonner's notion, particularly of the deformative, on which I also found completely intriguing and wanted to ask you, about what is being deformed. But you've answered that actually in this very interesting statement that where you talked about loss of separateness from the object of your creation. In other words, it's not exactly it's something like a collapse or a bringing together of the subject-object relation that it seems to me you're wanting to think with. And I had the same question for Maya also around what you were doing with spontaneity. You said at one point, what is being this amazing passage from The Waves, what you called a perception utterance. In other words, an utterance, I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but it's a sentence that could not be spoken in any other context, right? Which of course is absolutely what you get in The Waves. You cannot imagine, it's not vocalizing a character, it's not a thought process that the character can possibly be thought to be undertaking. So it's utterly new. It's an utterly unprecedented kind of utterance. Yes. What is being rendered, and you were putting a lot of investment into that figure. What is being rendered has not yet taken the form of an object. So the question is still for me both kind of is there something being deformed? Is there an object here? Is there a form of critique that you're undertaking? Is the politicalness of the concepts that you're exploring here, is there an object there that is being tussled with, deformed, changed? I just wanted to really hear you, let's hear you say more. I hate that kind of question. I just really want to hear you say more. But in a sense, it is that kind of comment, I suppose. What is the sort of, what is being deformed? What is being thought in this notion of spontaneity? Is it, is it, when the fire engine does not come, what is it that is being taken as an object there?
Sure. Well,
You want me to talk a little?
I can think about that a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I want to avoid the question, what is being deformed? Because deformativity is a speech act that shames, And so it's an act of shaming. There could be others too. It's not, belittling, that you could start to get into the J.L. Austin game and start generating a whole bunch that are similar but not quite exactly the same. Whatever is being deformed by way of a deformative utterance is performatively brought into being by way of that utterance. That was partly what I meant to be saying by way of Jose Munoz's painful example. It's impossible that his later self-understanding as queer is untouched by that prior experience. And so it's not that there is something that is being deformed, but that deformativity makes us into something. And it just seems important somehow to specify that. And in terms of subject-object relations, I want to just say that response to Erin's question was really a comment on the creative process as I experience and understand it. It's less a comment about the world of the performative and deformative that I'm trying to resuscitate for purposes of future use. It may be that they end up entangled in some way, but I haven't really thought about that in that way yet. And then maybe I'll add to your question for Maya. Sorry, you didn't expect this when you told me to go first, but
I got more to think about.
but it's just to remind all of us that in Kant, the child lacks spontaneity, and so that's one of the two creatures that lacks spontaneity. And so there's something from a Kantian perspective unspontaneous, but potentially still quite interesting about the child's apprehension of objects that we would understand through their conceptualization, but that they don't. And Kant would say, yeah. So
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, thank you. This is absolutely the heart of the issue for me. And I mean, Kant is so often ridiculed and probably rightly for reifying these kinds of subject-object relationships. But I do think there's this other strain, and it has to do with this notion of grasping the form of one's own cognition, that is actually part of what it is to experience an object, that you grasp there's an awareness of form that precedes an awareness of objects. And one very, very difficult question, but I think one that does have this kind of political potential that you're pointing to is, can we grasp a form in a way differently than we grasp the objects that become available on the basis of those forms? And the reason why that matters is because it means that the human understanding is not always just in search of closure or just in search of kind of recognizing itself and in pursuing what is already known, which, we saw Morrison identifies that with white supremacist kind of thinking, this idea of an understanding only finding its own image. And so what I do think is so radical in Woolf's form is resisting the model of a mind that is so frequently imposed on her fiction, that the mind is just in consciousness fiction, we're just presenting the ready-made contents as they appear in the mind, and that is a negation of such an important aspect of what she is evoking, and the only way she can evoke it is through a totally non-naturalistic description of these kids. So pushing against naturalistic description is really at the heart of this, and this is a very complicated issue because many thinkers, Chomsky included, have taken a kind of Kantian set of models about cognition precisely to affirm the radical endowment in kids, that in fact they can do what we have beat out of ourselves as adults that the kids can do. And I think you really see that in The Wolf.
Gabriel.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Maya, and it concerns the relationship of formal innovation to mobilizing unconscious knowledge, and also more generally the connection of spontaneity to unconscious knowledge. And what I have in mind is Anton Ehrenzweig, I think, is the theorist of creativity that has the most interesting analysis of this. And he says many of these experimental forms mobilize and appeal in readers and viewers to the or listeners to the primary process. And he argues that the primary process is an instrument of cognition that is far superior to the kind of conscious cognition we have, and it belongs centrally to the primary process. And Lyotard has then taken up the same thing in Discours Figure. And I wonder if that would be, perhaps I'm just also projecting. Decades ago, I wrote a chapter on the waves, and I loved that you combined the waves with Toni Morrison's jazz. But in the chapter on the waves, I tried to draw out how the appeal to unconscious forms of cognition would work. And so I'm just curious what you would say to it.
Thank you, Gabi. I need to read this kind of as soon as we're finished. And I think that this question of the unconscious is very unresolved for me. It's not the usual framework that I work with, but I think one of the loveliest things about pushing this question in Kant far enough, you are getting there. So it's I think, one way to think about it via Woolf is maybe not so much in this novel, but in Mrs. Dalloway, for example, the evocation of the non-propositional fragments of the mind that for her are kind of shoring up the possibility of a full-fledged propositional thought, which then kind of surfaces at the end of this process. Is it unconscious? Is it peripheral conscious? It's very, very difficult. I do think that Kant is accused of being so hyper-intellectualized. How is it possible that you're aware at every moment of this process of spontaneous synthesizing? And I think that there is a way in which the awareness of what one is doing when one is synthesizing could be called unconscious without it being necessarily oxymoronical. But it is such a basic sense of the ownership of what one is doing when one is putting together the image. It's a very difficult question.
Yeah, I should perhaps clarify that Ehrenzweig doesn't think that unconscious scanning is the exclusive process. He always combines it, but he says the mobilization and what we most strongly respond, and even in the creative process, comes from unconscious scanning, and the conscious scanning is then a kind of formalization and a secondary process.
And I just want to add one thing that I also really like about how you're putting this is that, I've kind of emphasized the production of new knowledge, but I think there is also a way in which the way you're putting it is very relevant, that it can also be the activation of a disavowed knowledge, that is also part of what's possible here through spontaneity.
Bruce had a question, but he's helping himself to tea. But so I thought I'd just say for 2 seconds, Maya, do you think that the sort of excessive demand that consciousness should accompany every stage of the synthesizing in Kant is resolved in Kant partly because he's distinguishing between transcendental and empirical psychology, and the excessiveness would appear only if we thought it was the standard empirical thing.
Yes.
But all he means is something very abstract, like the I think accompanies it, and which is completely different transcendental ideas. So
Yes.
that might be.
Yes.
So it's not necessary to reel in the unconscious. I think that he has the apparatus for it.
Yes, I do agree, and I think that's connected to the point in Wolf where these are not thoughts that happen. They are not representing a thought that happens, but
Sure.
it is a kind of formal awareness that is there at a different level from the empirical level.
Professor Roberts.
I'm struggling with my customary crudeness to make as much of a connection as possible between the literature rubric of our conference this year and the politics in political concepts. And in doing that, I found kind of hovering above or below the two papers, the very, very old-fashioned concept of freedom. I mean, it felt to me in different ways like both of the papers were trying to engage with what old-fashioned political theory would, maybe call freedom. And just to create as much dissension as I possibly can, I'll just, throw out a very, very crude contrast between the two papers from that point of view. It seemed to me, Maya, listening to you and writing down language in becoming more like music becomes itself again. I thought to myself, language, when it's not music or art or literature, isn't language.
Sure.
So, and in a crude way. So that would be kind of the stuff that we literary people just love,
Oh, yeah.
right? That freedom is located, in the exceptional nature of the artistic, the aesthetic, the literary. Whereas, and again, you probably both are going to disagree with this, I thought of Bonnie working with ordinary language and thinking there kind of is the freedom of political action happening in everyday language. In that, it takes a lot of work to get to it maybe, or to see it doing what you want it to do. But, so I would say ordinary language over on the one side and extraordinary language on the other. So you can both say no.
I mean, this is a wonderful question. I mean, but Bruce, why can't it be both everyday and poetic? Because in a way, that is exactly what the blues offers as an alternative philosophy of language is, why not take poetic language as the prototype for language as such? So I can be really a romantic in that way, but I am, but that's not to say it's not every day. And it's part of why I love Rousseau's Origin of Language so much. It's a fakakta history of, it's a totally messed up historical account, but the idea of taking poetic language as a point of reference for language use, and that it's not just something that happens in special cases. That would be my answer.
Lost the microphone. It's always difficult when we binarize and then we want to bring in the thing that we made into an opposite and say it's a supplement or it's the condition of possibility of the thing, and then we wonder why we binarized in the first place. So I think it's there is when you're working on a particular concept, it becomes exceptionalized. It's sort of in the nature of the focus on a concept. And then you do, however, have to then fold it back into place, hopefully somewhat altered by the experience of the focus. So I appreciate your reminder that this is work in ordinary language philosophy. I do think that ordinary language philosophy is really interested, especially in the Austinian and Wittgensteinian versions. I was really interested in the non-determination and the indeterminacy of language, which is a kind of vouchsafing of possibilities of free and unexpected conjugation. And I think the reason, certainly, why I remain attached to that approach is, I could say, because of all the we holds that we have yet to say, and that aren't necessarily going to be just unfoldings of the first one, but interruptions of what it put into place. So that's one set of things. On the other side, I just want to say one thing about the kind of what I hear in Maya's Kant is a kind of neurodiversity argument potentially about there being many modes of apprehension, and conceptualization is one. And it isn't, I mean, now we're on Maya's Kant and not on Kant. It isn't necessarily the best of them. It presupposes and requires this disturbing, unsettling experience that is resistant itself to conceptualization. But you can push that in this other direction, inspired perhaps by deformativity, which is neurodiversity's been on the receiving end of that for a long time, and to think about how what Kant really makes available is a kind of spectrum of ways of knowing or apprehending, I wouldn't call it knowing, of apprehending the empirical world. So, and I think that's interesting and important. I don't know how many Kantians will agree that that's something you can get from Kant, but I certainly like the idea of doing it.
Ron.
Thank you both for those two really provocative papers. I just had a question for Maya. As I was listening to your paper, I was trying to work out what it is that spontaneity is adding to the sort of conception of like literary authorship. Just because, and it's partly due to just certain kinds of tensions that seem to surface in Morrison's own sort of account of authorship, right? The one account where the literary text seems to be sort of thinking about itself seems to be this like really radical push to sort of absolutely remove presence, authorial presence from the process, right? But yet when you get to the readings that you put up, the passages that you put up, they seem so kind of like intentional themselves and so crafted and mannered and constructed linguistically that it seems like there's a kind of level of intentionality at play there that belies the claim that she's making, about the work acting sort of independently. So I just wondering like how you're thinking about authorship and the presence of the author as a part of this whole dynamic.
Thank you, Ron. That's I really need to think more about that, and I think it's such an interesting way to kind of focus on this question of agency also, because I do think there are very significant tensions between Morrison's notion of authorial agency and a Kantian picture. I mean, I think that there is where really the philosophical divergences need to be underscored. I mean, I'd love to hear what some other Morrison people, Michael, think about this, but I mean, the idea of a completely self-generated agency, that is totally refuted by Morrison's account of the composition of Beloved, for example. So kind of the limits of Kant's individualism and the notion of a kind of agency emanating from this just the self, I think, is really in question in important ways. At the same time, also the kind of formalist adage about the separation of the text from the author, the intentional fallacy stuff. I subscribe to that. I don't think Morrison really does. It's an interesting case because she, like Woolf, you have to deal with them as a critic and as an artist, and sometimes the two coincide, and sometimes you theorize differently on the basis of the work than they are theorizing. So I think that's a difficult problem.
Hannah, I didn't quite understand. Did you have something to intervene on this point? No. Okay, good. So there are 5 more questions, but Adi, there's no rush, right? We can just do it one by one. Yeah? Okay. So
I
Jacques,
can be shorter in my answer.
Bonnie, you used the word conjugation, and I heard the conjugal as well as the yoking together. Maya, you used the word, once you used the word metaphor. Um, but but I heard in both talks an effort to think an a priori metaphoricity that is specifically the way in which you can apprehend the form non-conceptually. So this would be my summary, base zero summary of what I found together in the talks. I wondered if in Bonnie's case, how in Bonnie's case, the notion of conjugation leads to the political dimension, a political dimension in how to do things with words in Austin. And then in Maya's, I wondered if you could say a little bit, not about the waves, but about To the Lighthouse and about grammaticality as a means for creating precisely the kind of a priori synthesis that you're then saying in the waves occurs at the level of metaphor, perhaps.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure. Sorry, I just have to hold it. I'm not sure I agree with premise. I don't think I'm trying to apprehend a form non-conceptually. I think I'm trying to apprehend a concept and cling to it. I think I did use the word conjugation. Of course, you're right. Although I think it was in the Q&A. I'm not sure it was in the talk, but I would use it in writing because I think of concepts as things that can be conjugated beyond obviously their current meaning or connotations. But I think, I mean, I was very conscious when I was writing this paper and thinking about this project that I'm working on, that the question, which I certainly posed, but which I haven't fully answered to my own satisfaction, is, whether there's any, dirge to be sung for the performative in its more original Austinian sense, or whether, we've moved on. Is there a loss in the moving on? Because I think we're no longer, I'm probably one of the few people who's still teaching how to do things with words. So, are you? Great.
Yeah, me too.
So, that's great. I mean, I picked this concept for this conference for a reason. And I definitely took out a lot of material that I had on both Butler and Austin because I was assuming we could take that as known and just go from there. So I don't think this is a random selection of people. Anyway, so, but I do think that conceptual analysis and ordinary language philosophy approaches to Austin, as to Wittgenstein, have a tendency to wipe the political valences out of those systems of thinking. And perhaps for that reason, conceptual renovation seems not costly because we're not attentive to the politics that attached to them. So that's really how I understand what I'm doing. I'm not honestly comfortable with the idea of thinking of myself as someone who tries to apprehend a form non-conceptually. Yeah, that seems, I'm sorry, we're supposed to be quick. That seems to be evacuative of something that I would want to argue strongly for in an agonistic political theory perspective. So, sorry.
No, I think I'm with you, Bonnie and Jacques. I mean, you really, for me, metaphor is really a key term, and for me, very much with Wallace Stevens, it is the figure for a kind of conceptual knowing that is not fully determinate. I wouldn't call it non-conceptual. It's really quasi-conceptual. That's what's so wonderful about metaphor. It is that moment of a kid who is learning a concept for the first time, and it still has an experiential character attached to it. Yeah.
You use the sentence was you grasp the form in a way you don't grasp the object.
Yes.
Right. So if we think of both of these are modes of grasping, it's just that one is we can call more classically conceptual, and the other one isn't. Is that okay?
Yeah, but it's difficult because sometimes when you say, oh, it's non-concept, it's quasi-conceptual, they say, oh, then it's not performing cognitive work. And I think metaphor is exactly as Akil was making plain yesterday. It is performing cognitive work in a different way. Just about the lighthouse, since you mentioned it, I do make a bit of a line in her corpus. I think some of those earlier, like the lighthouse is incredibly different set of philosophical preoccupations and much more interested in the associative links of an empiricist picture. So like that moment that Auerbach talks about with fixing the kid's boot, and that becomes an occasion, or stalking, and that it becomes an occasion for thought. There is a much more emphasis on tracing the links of association as they unfurl. And I think that something different is happening in the waves, where there's this activity of construction takes the foreground, but it is on a continuum. We'll talk about it.
Well, there are 5 questions, and it's getting on to 12. So I just hate this bureaucratic form of asking all the questions to be gathered together and answered, but there's nothing to be done. Unless there is something to be done. Can we just... So do you want me to cluster the questions? Yeah, all right. Emily?
You must be getting tired. So a quick question about, I guess it starts with Maya, but it goes to Bonnie's as well, about spontaneity. It's a heuristic question. So I think you went through Kant, sentience, and it's basically a cognitive take on this. And your examples were not dialogic. They were stream of consciousness, which is interesting. So I guess my question is, first of all, if we're talking about the era of Sedgwick, what happens to affect in all of this? Perhaps it rejoins the unconscious question. And the question for both of you is how discursive, how violence, a certain kind of undercurrents, especially not just, how is effective violence channeled discursively in terms of this question of awareness? And I had in mind, listening to both of you, both the violence that's in neutral speech, such as we hold that, but also I had Rankin's, Just Us, or parts of Citizen in mind, where it's the dialogic, casual, clueless discussion that captures this kind of discursive violence. And you could call it affect, but where does that register in awareness? What kind of performative violence is how does that fit these two different ways of approaching language?
Amanda.
Okay. Just quickly, and this is for Bonnie. The deformative. Is there a risk that it is too narrowly identitarian? By that I mean, I'm going to just make a couple of observations. If it's about the shame on you, so if it's about an injury to identity, does that limit the kinds of ways in which we might see a limit to the we hold? So, if we think of shame, like, let me give you another instance of shame on you. Shame on you directed at political actors, not because of their identity, but because of actions that they undertook. And that's within a kind of model where you have an aspiration to certain forms of political commitment. that are not being met, but don't necessarily devolve entirely to identity. I mean, climate politics is right. So that's just my concern about routing it through so fundamentally through Sedgwick. So anyway.
Adi, you're going to cede your question? Okay, Sharon?
So another question for Bonnie about the deformative. I really like also the move of wrapping that into the performative rather than treating it as something separate. But I guess my question is, are you seeing that as an inevitability of every performative, or a kind of always present danger of any performative? And maybe the difference doesn't matter that much, but the way that it seemed to me that it might matter is from the standpoint of democratic politics and political action. If every performative that I undertake inevitably is going to generate a deformative that brings harm, doesn't that risk a kind of paralysis, or doesn't it, raise that as a possible difficulty? Now, maybe knowing that any performative could do that already, raises, and anyway, I just wonder what you think about how to navigate that and how to balance a kind of sense of responsibility for the possible deformatives that are entailed in our performatives with the other thing that we need as in democratic politics was a kind of confidence or willingness to risk, and maybe even a willingness to risk not just ourselves, but others potentially.
Hannah, did you want to come back?
Yeah, briefly. Sorry, I'm invested in this. So I want to return. Maya, how much does Woolf's queerness matter to your reading? And I ask that because improvisation has been such a key concept in queer studies. So on, queer studies, which has been on the one hand interested in theorizing stigma and thinking about the violence of the norm, and on the other hand, thinking about all of the improvisatory modes of intimacy that are possible.
So who'll go first?
I'll just say quickly, Emily and Hannah will answer together because I think they're very related. Woolf's queerness to me really comes out in her transformation of the way we read David Hume. And I can't say it all right now, but her father was so important in there's a kind of patriarchal transmission of Hume via Leslie Stephen, and then there's a different interpretation that comes out formally through those earlier novel and I think there's a possibility of kind of queering this trajectory in the philosophy of mind through her work, and also renewing the emotional poignancy of these kind of technical questions of synthesis and continuity and discontinuity that arise in the passage from Hume to Kant. Like when Woolf's character Rhoda says, I can't make my experience merge into the next. I can't make one moment merge into the next. To me, they're all violent, all separate. Okay, that is like renewing why this David Hume issue actually matters in the world. So that's just my answer for now, but I'd love to talk more.
You have 3 or 4 other questions to answer.
Not me, Bonnie does.
I think they had 2, she has 2, and I have 3.
Okay.
It's not a competition, though. It's okay.
But did you answer both?
I think I did answer both.
Okay, go ahead, Bonnie.
Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, for these questions and for all of the discussion. It's been really great. I appreciate it. I'll just, the question of what happens to affect is that I'm putting it on hold so that we can finish what we started in the 90s before the turn to affect took us somewhere else. So we'll hold that for a moment for this project, maybe. And the question of violence, was posed very explicitly by Leela Gandhi last night when she tried to say that performativity is as such violent, a position that I do not accept. But that doesn't mean that all performatives are free of violence, nor does it mean that all performatives necessarily carry a deformativity with them. It simply means that it's quite possible. And there are, of course, degrees of violence. So doing some violence, as it were, in order to defend your democracy is quite different from the kinds of violence that stigmatize and minoritize people. I think maybe we want to take that out of the tape. So it sounds like I just called for violence, and I didn't mean it that way. I think Rankin's Justice and Just Us is such a great example of how like a nice word can harbor a deformative term, how a performative can harbor a deformative. So because it's so pithy and also so obviously correct. To Amanda, I want to say that, you know, the argument that I don't want to be repeating the argument that Sedgwick and Fellman and Butler make against Austin, which is he has this first example, it's the first one, he repeats it, it's the one that gives everything else away, the I do. I don't want to repeat that by suggesting or sounding like I'm suggesting that the shame on you is exemplary of the deformative. It's just an example. For Sedgwick, it's exemplary. For me, it is not. I wanted to be clear about why it works so well for her, both because it's an anti-queer constitutive experience and also because it doesn't have an I in the utterance. But I don't think that shaming is exemplary for what deformativity is. And I think the not you is actually, to me, which is my own invention, is a much more powerful example, partly because it puts the deformative into the performative. So when someone says, I do in a wedding, they're saying not you in 1993 to any gay people who are also there, right? Because they can say it and others can't. But it isn't only stigmatizing a particular identity either. In fact, I think the claim that I was making in the paper is that performativity, and this is to Sharon as well, might have a deformative, that its responsiveness to the remainders of all performatives, that's what is expected of democratic citizens, and some of those who are remaindered by a particular performative, like we hold a future one, a better one, should be remaindered by it because they are not part of the, you know, enhanced universalism of the claim that we gather around and that gathers us. So I don't have a problem with that. What I do want to do with this work, though, is to reinvest in the magical properties of language, of which performatives are one example, which allow us to reinvent the world that we live in. The world that we live in is in great need of reinvention. Abdicating to some extent, now I'll just say it provocatively, abdicating the powers of language to engineer such reinventions, it seems to be a particularly bad time for doing that. It also seems to me to be a very bad time to be thinking about performatives without also insisting on the absolute importance of constative truth and the need, therefore, for this binary view of language to be fully resuscitated and not just one of its halves. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay. So, Jacques, you have an announcement to make. No? Adi, did you say that? No announcement? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.